like you almost got to kind of build rapport with like the anti-flat earthers so they can chill out a little bit. Then you got to approach it a specific way because if you're toxic, they're not going to acknowledge anything. And then you got to present something that is undeniable. That way you can start to open up their mind. One last thing that I'll say, and maybe Witsit can just comment on this, because we couldn't really get into like the details too much because they were just glitching on the surface level. And shout out to them, man. You know, at the end of the conversation, it was a pretty cordial back and forth. So I'm not really trying to like, make an example out of them. I just want to highlight like this is kind of what it is when you talk to some of these guys. But one thing in the paper that I found super interesting, and like I said, Wis, if you want to chime in on this before Alan jumps in, this is the last paragraph in the conclusion by Luka Popov. He said, there is another interesting remark that follows from this analysis, aside from the fact that geocentrism is extremely viable, right? Something else that's interesting. If one could put the whole universe in accelerated motion around the Earth, right? All the cosmos, spinning in motion around the Earth, the pseudo potential corresponding to pseudo force would immediately be generated. That same pseudo potential then causes the universe to stay in that very state of motion without any need of exterior forces acting on it. Now, this is super interesting. Like I said, I'll let Witsit if you want to like kind of break this down a little bit for you guys, because they always say, well, like if the Earth's not spinning and the universe is spinning, how does it stay in motion, level heads? And the paper just tells you exactly how. Witsit, did you want to like kind of chime in on this?
No, that's so the part to understand, because what a lot of them will do is they'll go and they'll look at the paper and they'll see the word pseudo and they'll immediately be like, oh, so it's saying you have to invoke pseudo forces, which is really funny because it actually says that in the heliocentric paradigm, effectively, it would be pseudo. But in the Machian geocentric position, it would be real. That's what it says in the conclusion, right? But so they'll go from like thinking that a refutation is that it's a pseudo force to immediately uh, the pseudo force is accurate and true and real somehow because that's what when they find out that's actually what their model claims, which is super funny. So that's just like the number one thing I hear is like it has to invoke pseudo forces. It's just the easiest way to know they have no idea. They didn't comprehend the paper at all, right? They're just looking for some way to dismiss it. But anyway, he points out that it's a pseudo force, and he's obviously operating from within the assumed framework that's accepted in consensus. And he's pointing out that in this other framework that he's proposing, it would actually be a real force, which is what I always try to point out is that like the satellites themselves are actually they would actually be a dynamic proof of geocentrism because they account for real inertial forces, and that's a dynamic distinction. So you can't just say it's like kinematically equivalent because it's like dynamically different, right? It's like physics. But anyway, so then what the implications are with what you just brought up is that the only thing that would be needed for a geocentric universe with this type of framework, which I do think that this framework is accurate, not specifically Newtonian gravity or the distances or the masses, but the general physics. I think that this is how it works. I think it's actually just all within a torus field, right? But you would just need some primary mover to start it. That's literally all you would need. So because like the PhD astronomer Robert Parks, right? He came back finally after I nagged him to read it after he was pretending that I never sent him the papers and I called him out publicly, and then he responded. He could only come up with what's causing it to move, and I'm like, did you not read it? And I explained it, right? Obviously, you have the centrifugal, the centripetal. The centripetal is twice the magnitude of the centrifugal. So, in like really simple terms, you have the force that's generated outward, like the tendency for the object to continue out away from the center of rotation, and then you have the force that's generated towards the center, and that force going towards the center is twice the magnitude, meaning that you would have a net inward force. So it would be this like seesaw balancing back and forth, right? These forces playing off of each other, and there would be a stronger force going in, so it would just keep spinning around basically. So it wouldn't someone's tried to say that it would like defy the second law or something, right? Because entropy increases, usable energy increases, but they don't know it wouldn't because it's balancing back and forth, right? Like it's got multiple forces acting, and so then it's going back and forth and basically always trying to equalize, and so it would perpetually move. So you would just need something to start it. And what Professor Parks said was, like what's causing it to move, and so I had explained that to him, and then he's like, oh well, then what? Yeah, but okay. So the only problem, he basically what he's saying is that out of all the papers and all this fake claim about how we know the Earth's moving around the sun, once I really pushed the claim on him and made him address it, the PhD in astronomy, a professor, came back and said that the only thing that he could come up with as a rebuttal as to why it wouldn't work or he doesn't believe in it is, well, what would have caused it to move in the first place? I'm like, really? Is that the standard that we're holding cosmology to now, right? Where you have dark matter and dark energy and a big bang with a pre-existing energy that you don't acknowledge and you can't define, you're not sure how it works, and you have the horizon problem and you have the cosmological constant problem and you have the flatness problem, and all of a sudden, uh, this problem that exists for any cosmology, right? What was the primary mover? We're asking about God at that point. I'm like, that's all you got. So I'm guessing you're going to keep that same energy for your cosmology, right? So then you're a geocentrist because you have like 10 more questions that can't be answered, whereas my answer would just be God, right? It's whatever you want to call it, the supreme consciousness, the primary mover, regardless of what cosmology you believe in, something had to set everything into motion, right? Something had to, so, and anyway, long story short, that's all you would need. And then the basically the magnitude of the whole universe when it started rotating, it would just keep doing it, you know. And so it's like geocentrism is significantly more viable, even within the Newtonian framework. Significantly, it's not even remotely close. So I love that paper for that reason. He has two follow-ups where he tackles like parallax and retrograde and stuff like that. So I won't rant anymore on that. Although I think those are really important points. And the last thing I'll say, they obviously started to bring up retrograde as if they were going to school you on what it was, like they were telling you about the phenomena of retrograde, and that's kinematics again. And so that's why with this second episode I did on Middle Ground, I just covered kinematics dynamics, and it was like super redundant, because that is actually the first thing I guess we figured out you have to make sure people understand is like the difference in kinematics and dynamics. So that would be the only thing I would say in that scenario. I know how that goes. I'm in environments like that a lot. There's a 0% chance you were going to be able to like actually explain the difference in kinematics and dynamics and how it applied to the conversation. Like there's no way you could have done that. But that is the
Not
proper
even to
thing
the
to
guy
do.
with the physics degree, bro. Not even him.
No, there's no chance. There was no chance. They would have been interrupting you and deflecting and avoid. I know how it goes, So that's why I kind of stopped doing it, honestly. But yeah, so anyway, that would be my only. It's like people need to understand that paper. That's like the home run paper, right? It's like people need to understand the kinematics first. Like everyone has this like misconception in their mind that the fact we can map out the planets and their paths and their orbits and their cycles, which you did point out, like the Babylonian like flat Earth civilization mapped out, right? They didn't understand the magnitude or the implications of that because honestly, like they weren't following you, bro. Let's just be real. But so it's like they need to understand the first step of it, which is kinematics. So like how we see the planets move, parallax. So how we see the stars move, aberration, retrograde. I mean, you can grant all those things. You can grant parallax, even though there's a huge dispute, and it doesn't really seem to be the phenomena that they even pretend has to be explained. It's like completely fraudulent. But it's like just grant it all. It's like they need to understand, dude, the way that Mars moves and Mercury and Venus and the sun and the moon and all that, that's all just kinematics and it works perfectly both ways. And that's called relative motion. If you go the approach of teaching them the very basic, like elementary aspect of relativity, their pride and ego, they're going to immediately concede because what they're going to do you're basically trapping them. It's like mental jiu-jitsu. You're trapping them to concede because they're going to be like, of course I know what relative motion is, right? And so you're just going to trap them into conceding the kinematic equivalence. And so then once you can get them to understand that and that phrase, that's going to make the conversation like 1,000 times more efficient. That you can now start using the word kinematic, the phrase of kinematic equivalence, right? Like, and then of course you'll just have to keep correcting them. They'll start conflating dynamics and kinematics, and then you'll pull out that paper, because what they'll end up doing is defaulting to like, oh well, then what causes it? Because we can explain it, and then you can say, well, actually, you can't explain it. And neither Einstein nor Newton work, and everyone knows this, and they're trying to replace it. And so, if you're going to keep that same energy about how, oh, well, you need to have a force that adequately explains it, or your model can't be true, then applying your own logic, your model can't be true. But even further than that, I can take both of those and show you the dynamic equivalence. Then you give them that paper. So that's what I think, right? I think not only do you have to start with I'll actually stop now. This is the last thing I'll say. Not only do you have to start with motion and geocentrism, because if they can't even get there, which you're going to never get past there with most people, because it's not about any specific details or evidence. It's about either the mainstream model I was told and everyone thinks is true, or I can't handle it. That's why you should start with just this. No way you should be talking about eclipses with these people. It's retarded. These people can't accept that the Earth may not be moving around the sun. You start with geocentrism, you get the kinematic part, and you make sure they understand it, and then you get into the dynamic part. If they get that far, right? I mean, that's going to be a whole night.
Well, that's the whole thing, man. Like, they did not expect somebody like you realize this. Like, they thought they were beyond you. They thought they were fucking smarter than you. And nobody would fucking realize this. And